Bread was a vitally important part of the diet of everyday people 250 years ago. Most people got their bread at the baker, whether they lived in the city, the town, or the village. But there is one bread recipe that shows up over and over in the cookbooks in the 18th century that isn't your typical bread. Your everyday bread, the bread that the baker bakes, it had just 4 ingredients: flour, yeast, water, and a little bit of salt. That was what was legally called bread in the 18th century in many areas. Baking bread isn't necessarily easy, and most people let the baker do it because he had the specialized equipment for it. Large kneading troughs and the special oven, a huge oven that could bake bread all day long. Most people in their homes did not have an oven like that, and some homes didn't have any oven at all. And so if they needed things baked, they would take it to the baker to have him do it. One of the reasons we know that most people didn't bake their own bread is because there are not very many just regular bread recipes in the cookbooks of the 18th century. Either they weren't baking it or it was so easy they didn't need a recipe, and there are some very easy recipes. So I don't think that's the point here. I think most people aren't bothering to bake regular bread, but there are some breads that they are interested in baking at home. Now, the bread we're doing today is called French bread, and it's not necessarily called French bread because it's exactly like the bread from France, because, well, basically every region has its specialty breads. But in this circumstance, in England and probably North America in this 18th century time period, they wanted a fancy bread, so they called it French bread. Now, what's so fancy, what's so special about this particular bread? Well, it's an enriched bread. Instead of having just those plain 4 ingredients, it has those, but it also has milk, it has eggs, it might have butter. Sometimes the recipes even included suet and sugar. So this bread has a lot of different ingredients. And as opposed to the regular bread that you're gonna get from the baker, it's got a very, very fine texture to it. It's very soft, very spongy. Now, you would think maybe a bread like that would be hard to make, but in fact, it's even easier to make than regular bread. I think it's one of the reasons why it shows up in the cookbooks. Not only is it very, very desirable because of its texture and its flavor, but it's super easy to do. This French bread recipe seems to show up in most of the cookbooks in the 18th century, and you can push it back farther than that. I found almost exactly the same bread recipe in May's cookbook from like 1665. So it's a very old recipe, and it does continue to kind of change a little bit, but it's essentially the same in the Art of Bread cookbook that's all the way into 1805. So it lasts for a long, long time. And most of the recipes are very, very similar with little changes here and there. Sometimes they'll talk about not bothering to put in butter, or it'll have fewer eggs or more eggs. And most of them don't bother to put in something like sugar, but they all are very, very similar. And one of the classic parts about this recipe is the fact that it is not kneaded to any great amount. Basically, you combine those ingredients, you swirl them around in your bowl, and then whoop, stop. You don't do anything else to it. The more you knead it, the harder it will be, and that's not what we're looking for in this bread. This bread undoubtedly was baked by the baker also. He did all kinds of specialty breads. In fact, at times he might make specialty breads on purpose because the price of his regular bread was regulated and he couldn't make enough money. So you make less of that regular bread, you make more of these specialty breads. These didn't have the price controlled, so he could kind of fix his margins. It's interesting that as you go digging into the cookbooks, there are some that have no bread recipes at all, and some cookbooks that this is the only bread recipe that you'll find. So let's make French bread. I've got a recipe here from the Family Dictionary by William Salmon in 1716. So this is a pretty old recipe. He had 4 different recipes for French bread in that little cookbook. And here is this one. It says, French bread another way. Take a quart of fine flour, 4 spoonfuls of ale yeast, a little salt, 4 eggs, Make it very soft with milk and water lukewarm. Keep it in a quarter of an hour by the fire to rise. Toss it into wooden dishes and let it bake an hour and a half. Now these recipes are all over the place. This one is actually a very small recipe, only a quart of flour. So many of them are huge, like they'll talk about a bushel of flour, say 40 pounds, or a peck of flour, 14 pounds. So this one's very small. A quart would be like just maybe a pound of flour, maybe a little over a pound. I'm actually gonna bring this up, which usually I shrink my recipes. I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger, and we're gonna start off with about 2.5 pounds of flour. And then we're gonna add our ingredients. We do have our wet ingredients, which are milk and our water. We're gonna put a little butter in this one. So like a lot of them have just, you know, a touch of butter. We're gonna put a little bit of butter in it also. And this is gonna go together really quickly. Let's put 2 pounds of flour into a large mixing bowl. We do want to have enough room to work in our bowl. We're not going to roll this out and knead it, so we're going to do everything right here in the bowl. Before we forget, let's sprinkle salt in right here and now. I'm going to just sprinkle in like a little handful of salt here. Without it, boy, it just doesn't have the flavor. Let me set this dry bowl aside really quick, and let's start to work on our wet ingredients. Because it's cold in here and it's winter, I'm gonna put our milk and our water together, and I'm gonna get them up to a little bit warmer than lukewarm. If you read many of these recipes, they're very careful about the temperature, and they'll say, you know, in the summertime do this, in the wintertime do that. It is cold in here, it is wintertime, and if you're baking bread, that yeast needs a very particular temperature, so we're trying to hit that mids, like 95 to 100 degrees kind of temperature, so that we can mix our milk and our water and our yeast together. Now the yeast I'm using here is a pre-mix that's emulating barm. In the time period, they had a liquid yeast that they would get from the brewer. Not very many of us have access to the brewer and yeast. If you do that, make sure to get something that was an ale yeast, not a bitter yeast left over from beer, which has hops in it. We don't want that bitter beer flavor in here. We want a nice ale. This also has eggs in it, and we're gonna use 3 eggs. We're gonna use the whole egg. Many recipes separate out, talk about using the whites and the yolks, and we don't need to worry about that. We're gonna use 3 whole eggs, and we're gonna whip them up in a bowl. I'm gonna go ahead on the fire and melt about 2 ounces of butter. Now all these can come together. I'm just gonna take our flour and create a little depression in the center of the flour, and I'm gonna pour in all my wet ingredients. We wanna hold back on the water and the milk because we want to try to get to a very particular texture here. Everybody's flour is a little different, and it certainly was true in the 18th century, and that's why you don't see exact ratios of flour to liquids. And we're just trying to hit this very, very soft dough, almost a batter, just a little beyond a batter into the dough state. And that's what we're trying to hit. So we're gonna slowly add our liquid ingredients until we get to just that right texture. Now that we've gotten the right texture, I'm just gonna kind of pull this together, and I can just pull the dough away from the edge of the bowl. I'm gonna tuck a little bit of flour around here so that it pops out of this bowl when it's done rising, because there aren't very many steps here. It isn't like regular bread where we let it rise and we punch it down and we let it rise again. This doesn't have any of that. So we're gonna roll this right out of the bowl into our cooking vessel. We want that to happen easily. Once this is risen, half hour, 45 minutes, it depends on the size of the recipe we're doing here and the temperature of our room, then we can roll it into our cooking vessel. Now, in the period recipes, they used this a lot of different ways. They might make a bigger loaf, or as this particular recipe described it, baking it in little bowls. Or many of them talked about creating rolls with this. So you might make a very, very small loaf. For this particular recipe, we could use it in all sorts of different ways. We're going to bake today in this Dutch oven. Because it's so cold outside and our outdoor oven is very difficult to bring up to temperature, it's going to be a lot easier just right here on the hearth to bake it in our Dutch oven. And Dutch ovens are a great way to bake bread, even in a modern kitchen. The Dutch oven holds the moisture in as it's baking, and it gives us a great texture for the outside. If we're using a bake oven, it needs to be preheated. And in some of the recipes, they even mention the idea that as our dough is rising over here, we want to make sure our oven is preheating. And some of these ovens in the 18th century took a lot of time to preheat. So in this case, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to get your bake oven preheated. I'm going to go ahead and put in some paper on the inside of this, just so it's really easy to get the loaf out. So I've got some sheets of parchment paper here. I'm going to line the inside. Another common feature to this particular recipe is the idea of what they would do when the loaf was done. They would chip the loaf or sometimes rasp the loaf, and they were trying to take all of the crust off the outside and off the bottom to leave it like this sort of yellow spongy cake. And that was what they wanted for the finished product. They wouldn't necessarily throw away this crust. It ends up being part of many recipes in the 18th century. I know it seems a little strange to us, the idea of cutting all the crust off, except for maybe kids' sandwiches, but it's what they wanted in the 18th century. Today, this crust tastes wonderful. I would never cut the crust off. In a modern oven, a large loaf like this will take approximately 45 minutes to an hour at about 400 degrees. This bread, it comes out of the oven and it just smells heavenly. It's got a nice, very firm crumb to it. Usually you can see it very fine texture. It's not got all that gluten built up from kneading it, so it's a very soft bread. And you can see from the loaf that I went ahead and chipped out that it's got a very spongy look to it. And I used a regular unbleached flour for this, just an all-purpose flour. This doesn't need any kind of incredible flour to make it nice. Even our lowest grades of flour are like the nicest grades of flour in the 18th century. So this would have been a very kind of fine flour in the time period. Here's our bread. I'm going to try this without any butter just to see what the true flavor of the bread is. And the texture is just perfect. It isn't tough. You don't have to, grind on it. And it's got a great bread flavor, a lot of, bread smells on it. So it's really, really a really nice bread. Now, if we add a little butter to it, it's just going to bring all that out, right? It's just going to add a little bit more salt. It's going to add more fat to it, and it's going to make this just right. Truly, a great loaf of bread. I can see how this toasted would be just to the top. And so many other recipes, especially for soups, included this bread. Pointed out, you might put the crust into the soup, you might have toasted sippets in it. This is the bread that is the classic 18th century bread of the cookbooks.